On 6 February 1952, at Sandringham House in Norfolk, King George VI died during the night. His daughter, Princess Elizabeth, was in Kenya with Prince Philip. By the time the formal proclamation was read at St. James's Palace on 8 February, she'd already been queen for 2 days. The constitutional transfer happened instantly. The household transfer didn't. Elizabeth was 25. Her mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, had spent 16 years living at Buckingham Palace as Queen Consort. After George VI's death, she became Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and the building that had been her home remained her home. Elizabeth and Philip needed Buckingham Palace because it was the official London residence and administrative center of the reigning sovereign. The Queen Mother's departure was expected by royal convention, but no statute specified an eviction date, no accession document named a particular suite, and no constitutional mechanism required her to leave on 6 February. That distinction matters because the popular version turns a complicated transition into a simple family confrontation. The documented record shows an immediate change of sovereign, a phased reorganization of households, a residence that needed renovation, and a senior royal who didn't want to move into the house selected for her. A later account says Prince Philip eventually resorted to turning off the central heating in the Queen Mother's apartments. Historian Jane Ridley described the incident in a Channel 4 documentary as a tale, a story, not a documented order. Newspaper reports repeated the claim, online videos made it more definite, and an audience comment later reduced the whole episode to one sentence. Prince Philip had her worked out when he had her heating turned off, so she moved out. The Queen Mother did leave Buckingham Palace. She moved into Clarence House in May 1953, roughly 15 months after George VI's death and about 2 weeks before Elizabeth's coronation. She remained associated with Clarence House until her death in 2002. The move is certain. The heating order isn't. Before the succession, Elizabeth and Philip lived at Clarence House. After their marriage in 1947, the residence was restored following wartime damage, and the couple moved in during June 1949. Their daughter, Princess Anne, was born there in August 1950. The restoration was designed for a young family rather than for a reigning sovereign. Accounts describe rewiring, central heating, modern kitchens, a lift, bedroom suites, and a nursery. Philip took an interest in the work and reportedly requested a basement cinema. One account put the final restoration bill at £78,616, divided between war damage, accumulated maintenance, and improvements. Clarence House could support domestic life. Buckingham Palace had to support monarchy. Buckingham Palace had been the official London home of the British sovereign since Queen Victoria moved there in 1837. It contained private apartments, offices, staterooms, ceremonial routes, and the departments that kept a large royal establishment functioning. Clarence House was a smaller Regency residence beside St. James's Palace, and the Queen Mother reportedly regarded it as an inferior replacement for the palace where she'd lived since 1936. Her descriptions vary by source. One account gives loathsome. Other versions use small and horrid. The exact wording isn't secure, but the broad point is she disliked the proposed move. A second residence was also in the background. After Queen Mary died on 24 March 1953, the Queen Mother reportedly hoped to move into Marlborough House, where Queen Mary had lived after George V's death in 1936. That option wasn't accepted, or it was considered too expensive. Either way, the residential question involved more than a daughter asking her mother to cross London. The Queen Mother had a preferred alternative. Clarence House needed work, and the palace was already occupied by the machinery of a new reign. The precedent for a widowed Queen Consort leaving the sovereign's principal residence was established. When George V died in January 1936, Queen Mary moved to Marlborough House. Queen Alexandra had also left the main royal residence after Edward VII's death. British constitutional practice, however, contains many rules that exist through convention rather than statute. Robert Blackburn's study of the monarchy describes conventions as procedures regarded as binding through tradition, custom, and common practice, rather than through written law. The Queen Mother's move belonged to that category. It was expected, institutionally sensible, and historically familiar, but no law set a departure date. Elizabeth's accession created a problem of household convention and practical allocation, not a documented legal eviction. The timing of Elizabeth and Philip's own move is important. Before 1952, Clarence House was their official London home. Detailed biographical summaries place their transfer to Buckingham Palace during the summer of 1952, after the first months of mourning. By 4 November, Elizabeth was conducting the state opening of Parliament as sovereign, so the Queen Mother wasn't physically keeping Elizabeth outside Buckingham Palace for 15 months. The two households overlapped inside the same building while the new arrangement took shape. That overlap is less dramatic than the clean version, but it explains why the dispute became an operational problem. Buckingham Palace wasn't simply a private house with one family occupying the rooms and another waiting at the front gate. It was a large institutional building containing private apartments, offices, staterooms, service corridors, communications systems, and central departments. When Elizabeth became queen, the household of the sovereign had to be established. Philip received a separate household of the Duke of Edinburgh. The Queen Mother retained her own household. These establishments had distinct officers and staff, but they relied on the same physical palace and, in important areas, shared central services. A contemporary-style household list shows the scale and hierarchy of the institution. The sovereign's household included the Lord Chamberlain's office, the Master of the Households Department, the Privy Purse, equerries, pages, gentlemen ushers, chaplains, and the Royal Mews. In August 1952, Sir Piers Lee was listed as Master of the Household, Sir Alan Lascelles as Private Secretary to the Queen, and Group Captain Peter Townsend as a temporary equerry. Those titles didn't operate the heating by themselves. They show how authority traveled through the palace, from the sovereign and her advisors into offices, departments, and working staff. The domestic side was just as structured. Footmen and pages handled personal service and messages. Household officers coordinated daily operations. Property and maintenance personnel dealt with the building's fabric and systems. Engineers, electricians, plumbers, and other specialists were part of the practical infrastructure, although the available record doesn't identify which individuals were responsible for the Queen Mother's rooms in 1952. That missing detail matters. The story is often retold as though two complete households were operating with separate servants, separate boilers, and separate accounts. The evidence doesn't support that tidy picture. Separate royal households existed administratively, but the palace's central infrastructure was shared. There's no supplied 1952 staff roster showing duplicated engineering teams. No surviving budget identifies the cost of heating one set of apartments against another. No document records a dispute between a named housekeeper and a named boiler operator. The defensible description is overlapping claims on rooms and services within one centrally managed institution. That still creates pressure. A residence has to be heated, whether the resident is the reigning sovereign, a queen mother, or a guest. Rooms have to be cleaned. Messages have to be delivered. Repairs have to be scheduled. Staff need to know which household has authority over which space, and the same building has to accommodate ceremonial duties, private life, and administrative work, without allowing every family disagreement to become a public incident. The Queen Mother wasn't an ordinary relative who happened to be staying on. She had her own household, her own staff, and established expectations about access, precedence, and service. Elizabeth had just acquired the responsibilities of sovereignty, and Philip's household stood beside hers. The palace, therefore, had to express a new hierarchy while continuing to serve the previous generation. The staff had to make that overlap function. No named housekeeper, engineer, boiler operator, or page has been connected to the alleged heating incident. No staff memoir in the supplied record confirms that a worker received Philip's instruction or witnessed the Queen Mother's reaction. The available evidence does not establish who operated the controls, who passed on any order, or whether anyone below stairs knew the alleged purpose of a heating change. The narrower point is firm. Palace infrastructure was operated by staff, and any alteration to heating would have required staff or household management to implement it. The story's supposed mechanism wasn't a royal hand reaching for a valve. It was an instruction moving through an institution. That is why the heating anecdote is so revealing, even before its truth can be established. A family argument becomes operational only when it reaches an office, a department, or a person responsible for keeping the building running. Popular accounts add another uncertain detail: that Elizabeth asked her mother to leave, then asked again when the first request failed. One channel video presents that version in its title. Yet no correspondence, diary entry, or formal household record supplied here confirms two discrete requests, and no source gives their dates or wording. The number of requests is unverified. The institutional pressure wasn't. Elizabeth became sovereign on 6 February. Her mother was no longer Queen Consort. The convention illustrated by Queen Mary's 1936 move pointed toward a change of residence. Buckingham Palace was becoming the center of Elizabeth's reign, while the Queen Mother's continued presence reflected attachment to the palace, reluctance to accept Clarence House, the possibility of Marlborough House, and the time required to prepare a new establishment. Grief also belongs in the chronology, although the surviving evidence doesn't allow it to be measured. The Queen Mother had lost her husband suddenly, after 16 years as his consort. Her daughter had inherited the crown at 25. The move wasn't simply a change of postcode. It marked the end of the household and status she'd occupied since George VI became king in December 1936. Several motives can coexist. She may have been attached to Buckingham Palace, unhappy with Clarence House, waiting for Marlborough House to become available, or unwilling to abandon the arrangements of her former life. The sources don't establish one decisive motive, and the record doesn't support reducing the delay to a single personal failing. Elizabeth also had to manage the transition inside a system that preferred discretion to open confrontation. A public quarrel between mother and daughter would have damaged the family and the institution. A formal eviction would have misrepresented a matter governed by convention rather than statute. The household therefore absorbed the tension while the practical arrangements developed around it. Clarence House wasn't ready merely because someone had selected it on a plan. It needed alterations, redecoration, and a household capable of supporting the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret. One detailed reconstruction placed the work at about £10,800. Group Captain Peter Townsend was reportedly involved in organizing the move. That cost covered more than changing a few curtains. The building had to be adapted to a senior royal household, and the Queen Mother had to accept a residence she reportedly regarded as loathsome or small and horrid. The difference between a residence being designated and a residence being usable is where months disappear. The timing was complicated further by Queen Mary's death. Until 24th of March 1953, Marlborough House remained associated with the Queen Mother's preferred alternative. After Queen Mary died, the question of who should occupy it became part of the allocation of royal residences. If Marlborough House wasn't available or was considered too expensive, Clarence House became the practical destination, even if it wasn't her first choice. The move was therefore administrative, domestic, and dynastic at the same time. By May 1953, the Queen Mother, Princess Margaret, and the Queen Mother's art collection had finally moved into Clarence House. A newspaper report dated 20th of May described her as having moved yesterday, placing the transfer around 19th of May. The coronation followed on 2nd of June. Elizabeth's coronation preparation had been underway for 14 months. Philip chaired the Coronation Commission, which was a break with precedent and gave him a substantial practical role in organizing the ceremony. The work involved committees, Commonwealth representatives, transport, decorations, television arrangements, and the movement of thousands of officials and service personnel through London. Philip's involvement wasn't ceremonial window dressing. He chaired the Central Commission while the Duke of Norfolk, as Earl Marshal, retained overall responsibility for the ceremony. The division of labor reflected Philip's position in the new reign. He wasn't sovereign, but he was increasingly involved in the machinery surrounding the sovereign. By the time Elizabeth traveled to Westminster Abbey, the Queen Mother's residence had been settled. The Irish state coach carried her toward the coronation, while Elizabeth and Philip occupied the central roles of the new reign. A 15-month residential transition had been completed before the most important public ceremony of the accession. Philip's role in that transition is harder to establish than his role in the coronation. His modernizing reputation is documented through identifiable decisions. At Buckingham Palace, he supported internal telephone and communication systems that reduced reliance on footmen carrying messages. The change affected an old service tradition and reportedly met opposition from the Queen Mother, whose preferences were more closely associated with established methods of service. The telephone dispute gives a concrete example of the tension between them. A message carried by a footman preserved a visible hierarchy and a personal service tradition. An internal telephone made the exchange quicker and less ceremonial. Philip's preference was associated with speed and efficiency, the Queen Mother's with continuity and the established household. That clash doesn't prove the heating story. It does show that Philip was willing to alter systems that shaped the daily work of servants. His modernizing interests extended beyond communications. Accounts describe his involvement in reorganizing and renovating Balmoral and Sandringham, improving office systems and filing methods, supporting less formal royal practices, and encouraging the televising of the 1953 coronation. Winston Churchill opposed televising the ceremony, but the coronation went ahead before television cameras, and an estimated 27 million people in Britain watched it live. Philip later encouraged Elizabeth's televised Christmas message, which began in 1957. His public reputation as a modernizer came from decisions like these, rather than solely from stories about his temper. He also had a difficult institutional position. Elizabeth was sovereign. Philip was her husband and consort. He had no independent constitutional authority to determine the Queen Mother's residence. The household could listen to him, and Elizabeth could give him influence, but the formal center of authority remained the Queen. That makes the alleged heating order a story about informal power, rather than a constitutional command. Giles Brandreth's account describes Philip's mother-in-law as a tougher proposition than people thought, a remark reportedly preserved in a friend's diary from a 1962 dinner. Other accounts say the Queen Mother called Philip the Hun, reflecting tensions over his German family connections and his challenge to older royal habits. These details establish a strained relationship, but they don't establish a motive for the heating story, nor do they prove that Philip was cruel or vindictive. They show two people associated with different approaches to the royal household. The Queen Mother with established practice, Philip with modernization and direct intervention. In the Channel 4 documentary, Queen Elizabeth, Love, Honor, and Crown, Professor Jane Ridley is reported as saying, "The Queen Mother won't move," and Philip becomes exasperated by this. The wording limits the claim. "There's a tale" doesn't mean the records show it. "He tries" doesn't identify a written order, a date, an intermediary, or a witness. The account doesn't say which rooms were affected, how long the heating was off, whether the Queen Mother knew Philip was responsible, or whether she moved because of it. The Express repeated the incident as something Philip was said to have done. Later online versions removed some of that uncertainty. The audience comment that received 126 likes presented the anecdote as fact and ended with, "Good work, sir." The source chain therefore moves from a historian describing a tale, to newspapers repeating a reported act, to online retellings treating it as settled history. At each stage, the memorable mechanism survives: a prince, a heating system, and a queen mother who eventually leaves. The qualification is easier to lose because it occupies only 2 words. No written instruction signed by Philip has been found. No memo from the master of the household identifies a heating shutdown. No palace maintenance log records the incident. No named engineer, housekeeper, or page confirms it. The major biographies identified for this story: William Shawcross's official biography of the Queen Mother, Ben Pimlet's account of Elizabeth II, Philip Eads' biography of Philip, and Giles Brandreth's account of Philip and Elizabeth, aren't supplied as documentary sources for a direct heating order. Technical records from the modern royal household describe heating as the responsibility of property and maintenance staff, with boilers, pipework, radiators, valves, and controls managed institutionally. Later documents describe a building management system controlling heating, cooling, and hot water, although those technical details can't be projected directly onto the Buckingham Palace system of 1952. They do establish the institutional principle. Heating belonged to palace operations, not to the private control of an individual royal. If the anecdote reflects a real event, the change would have passed through staff or household management. The available evidence doesn't establish whether Philip personally spoke to anyone, acted through the Queen, used the master of the household's department, or simply became attached to a story that later generations found perfectly plausible. That distinction changes the image. The familiar version makes Philip sound as though he personally turned a control and watched the problem disappear. The evidence supports only a later account claiming that the heating in the Queen Mother's apartments was turned off, with no surviving record of who authorized the change or who carried it out. The mechanism remains institutional even in the folklore. Philip didn't need constitutional authority to influence the Queen's household. He chaired the Coronation Commission, pressed for telephones, supported changes to establish service arrangements, and took an active interest in palace systems. But he wasn't the sovereign, and the evidence doesn't show that he possessed direct personal control over a boiler room or apartment heating circuit. A story in which he ordered staff to turn off the heating is therefore consistent with his reputation for practical intervention, but consistency isn't confirmation. The Queen Mother's move has a stronger documentary trail. Clarence House had been the London home of Princess Elizabeth and Philip from 1947 until the accession. After Elizabeth became queen, she and Philip moved to Buckingham Palace, while Clarence House was prepared for the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret. Royal collection material identifies Clarence House as the Queen Mother's home from 1953 until her death in 2002. The concise official version sometimes says she moved in 1952. More detailed accounts place her settled move in May 1953, shortly before the coronation. The difference appears to reflect 2 stages. The residential reassignment began after Elizabeth's accession, but the Queen Mother's household wasn't fully established at Clarence House until the following year. May 1953 is the stronger date for the completed move. Her London life then continued from Clarence House for almost half a century. She also used Royal Lodge at Windsor, Birk Hall, and the Castle of May. She died at Royal Lodge on 30 March 2002, aged 101, but Clarence House remained the residence most closely associated with her later public life. The documented outcome is therefore straightforward. Elizabeth's sovereign household occupied Buckingham Palace during 1952. The Queen Mother remained there through a prolonged transition. Clarence House was altered, Queen Mary's death affected the available alternatives, and the Queen Mother moved in May 1953 before the coronation. The undocumented mechanism is the heating story. That mechanism compresses the longer process into one clean act. Philip becomes the impatient modernizer. The Queen Mother becomes the immovable traditionalist. Palace staff become the unseen operators who translate a royal decision into a change in the building. The documented record is more complicated. The Queen Mother's continued residence wasn't a confirmed legal violation. Elizabeth's 2 requests aren't documented in the supplied evidence. The 14 months figure is an approximation. The February 1952 to May 1953 interval is closer to 15 months. The exact apartments occupied throughout the period aren't firmly established, and the palace wasn't necessarily running 2 completely independent engineering systems side by side. Those corrections don't erase the household problem. They define it more accurately. The succession was immediate, but the residents had to be prepared. The convention was clear, but the departure date wasn't. The Queen Mother's household remained inside Buckingham Palace, but Elizabeth's new household also took shape there. The family could negotiate privately, while staff and departments had to make the arrangement function publicly and operationally. That is where the heating anecdote gains its force. A constitutional change becomes real through ordinary systems. Rooms are allocated, furniture is moved, messages are delivered. A residence is rewired, redecorated, and staffed. Heating is maintained or altered by people whose names usually disappear from the historical record. The family remembers the change of reign. The household has to manage the change of address. No surviving source identifies the person who supposedly received Philip's instruction. No document proves Philip gave it. No record shows that turning off the heating caused the Queen Mother to leave. The only confirmed sequence is that she remained at Buckingham Palace after February 1952, moved into Clarence House in May 1953, and lived there until 2002. The reported solution sits beside that confirmed timeline, not inside its strongest documentary core. It may be that Philip really did use the heating system to end an impasse that protocol and family diplomacy had failed to settle. It may be that a practical instruction passed through household staff and later survived as an oral account. It may also be that the story attached itself to Philip because his documented modernization made the anecdote sound like something he might have done. What can't be said is that the order has been proven. What can be said is that the story understands something important about royal power. Even inside Buckingham Palace, authority had to pass through people, rooms, and systems. A decision only became material when someone in the household carried it out. If the heating account is accurate, an anonymous member of the palace staff translated an alleged instruction into an operational change. If it isn't, the confirmed move still followed the same institutional logic. The palace had to be reorganized, Clarence House had to be prepared, and the Queen Mother's household eventually had to leave. The standoff began with the death of George VI at Sandringham on 6 February 1952. It ended with the Queen Mother's move to Clarence House in May 1953, shortly before Elizabeth's coronation at Westminster Abbey. Between those dates stood a new queen, a grieving widow, a modernizing consort, several overlapping royal establishments, and a staff responsible for keeping one enormous building working. The family dispute was remembered in terms of status and residence. The enduring anecdote reduces it to a heating control. That reduction isn't established history, but it preserves the practical shape of the story. A royal household problem could only be resolved through the infrastructure that made royal life possible.